At the estate planning meeting, my uncle declared, "You get nothing, blood over everything." I revealed the DNA results I'd kept hidden, flipping the entire inheritance on its head. I, 34 sat in that mahogany-paneled conference room, leather chair cold beneath me, watching my uncle's smug face as he laid out his vision for my grandfather's estate. The old man had been dead for 3 weeks, and already the vultures were circling. My uncle sat at the head of the table like he owned the place, which, according to him, he soon would. The attorney droned on about assets and distributions, but I barely heard him. My focus was on my uncle's expression, that satisfied smirk he wore like a crown. He'd been building to this moment for years, dropping hints at family gatherings, making sure everyone knew he was the favorite, the real heir, the one who'd stayed close while I'd moved across the country for work. My uncle cleared his throat and addressed the room. He said that before we went any further, there was something that needed to be addressed. He looked directly at me and stated that this estate would be divided among blood relatives only. He emphasized blood over everything. It was what my grandfather would have wanted. Then he turned to me and declared flatly that I would be getting nothing. The room went silent. My aunt looked uncomfortable. My cousins shifted in their seats. The attorney glanced between us, clearly sensing tension but unsure of its source. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my face neutral. I'd known this was coming. My uncle had been laying the groundwork for months, ever since my grandfather's diagnosis. Little comments here and there about legitimacy, about who really belonged in the family, about blood being thicker than water. He continued, saying it was nothing personal, but facts were facts. He claimed my grandfather had confided in him before he died, expressing doubts about my parentage. My uncle said the old man never had the heart to confront my father about it, but everyone in the family had their suspicions. He insisted it wasn't right for someone who might not be real family to take from those who were. I watched him speak, noting how carefully he'd rehearsed this speech. He was looking at the others now, not me, playing to his audience. My cousins nodded along. My aunt looked away. The attorney started to interject, mentioning that without proof such claims were meaningless, but my uncle cut him off. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. He announced that he'd taken the liberty of having some research done. Inside were documents, medical records from when I was born, photographs with dates and locations circled, even a private investigator's report detailing my mother's activities 35 years ago. My hands clenched under the table. He'd gone through my family's private history like it was his right. He'd dug through my mother's past, my mother, who died when I was 12 and couldn't defend herself. The attorney examined the documents and stated that while they might raise questions, they proved nothing definitive. He emphasized that legal paternity had been established at birth, and my father had never contested it. My uncle leaned back in his chair. He said that was true, but my father wasn't here to ask, was he? He'd been dead for 10 years. My uncle suggested that maybe he'd known the truth and been too ashamed to admit it. He added that regardless, my grandfather's wishes were clear, family only. I finally spoke up, asking if he was finished. My uncle's smirk widened. He confirmed he was and asked if I had something to say. I told him I did, actually. I said I'd been expecting something like this, though I'd hoped he might show some shred of decency. I mentioned that he'd always been jealous of my relationship with my grandfather, of the time the old man spent with me, of the trust fund he'd established in my name. My uncle's face darkened. He snapped that my grandfather had been confused in his later years, that I'd manipulated him, playing the doting grandson while living thousands of miles away. I continued, saying it must have eaten at him, watching my grandfather light up whenever I called, how he'd brag about my accomplishments to his friends. I noted that my uncle had been right there, doing everything for the old man, and still I was the one he wanted to talk to. The room was tense now. My aunt told us both to calm down, that this wasn't helping anything. But I wasn't done. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my own folder. I mentioned that my uncle had brought up blood and DNA, and I thought it was interesting timing. I said that I'd actually done some genetic testing myself about 6 months ago, one of those ancestry services that everyone was using. My uncle's expression flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. I explained that the results had been fascinating, showing me cousins I'd never heard of, distant relatives scattered across the country. I said I'd started reaching out to some of them, comparing family trees, trying to understand how we were all connected. I opened the folder and pulled out several documents. I stated that what I'd found was particularly interesting regarding my uncle's side of the family. I mentioned that my uncle's father, my grandfather's brother, had moved away in the 60s and lost touch with the family. But his descendants were still around, still showing up in the genetic databases. My uncle's face had gone pale. I continued, explaining that when I compared my DNA results with these distant cousins, the numbers had been puzzling. I said I should have been their second cousin, but the relationship was showing as much more distant. I added that I'd found it odd, so I dug deeper. The attorney was paying close attention now. He asked what I was suggesting. I turned to my uncle and said that I wasn't suggesting anything about myself. My connection to my grandfather was exactly what it should be. But I mentioned that my uncle's connection was interesting. I stated that according to the genetic data, he wasn't actually my grandfather's son at all. The explosion was immediate. My uncle lunged halfway out of his chair, shouting that I was lying, that this was desperate and pathetic. He demanded to know how I could make such an accusation. I remained calm. I explained that I'd hired a proper genetic genealogist after seeing the initial results, someone who did this professionally for adoption cases and inheritance disputes. I said she'd confirmed it. My uncle shared no DNA with my grandfather's extended family, but he did match perfectly with another branch entirely. I pulled out another document and slid it across. I stated that my uncle's biological father had been a man who'd worked with my grandmother in the early 50s. I said he'd left town before my uncle was born, probably never knowing he had a son. My aunt gasped. My cousin sat frozen. The attorney was reading the document, his expression growing more serious. My uncle was shaking. He insisted it was impossible, that his mother would never have. He couldn't even finish the sentence. I said I was sorry, and I meant it. I told him I hadn't wanted to drop this on him like this, in front of everyone. I mentioned that I'd actually found out about this months ago and had been wrestling with whether to tell him at all. I added that what pushed me to act was learning about his plans to cut me out of the inheritance. I pulled out more papers, genetic reports, genealogical charts, even a letter from the testing company confirming the findings. I said I'd had everything verified multiple times because I'd known what it meant. The attorney asked if he could see all the documentation. I handed it over and watched as he reviewed page after page. The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, the attorney spoke. He said that if these results were accurate, and they appeared to be from legitimate sources, it would indeed change the dynamics of the estate distribution. He explained that my grandfather's will specify that his assets should go to his children and grandchildren, with certain provisions for blood relatives. My uncle was slumped in his chair now, all the fight gone out of him. He asked quietly how long I'd known. I told him about 4 months. I said that when I'd first gotten the results, I'd thought there must be a mistake. I mentioned that I'd run the tests again, used different companies, even paid for clinical grade testing. I added that every result had come back the same. He asked why I hadn't said anything. I explained that he was still my uncle, still the man who'd taught me to fish, who'd come to my high school graduation when my father couldn't. I said that DNA didn't erase 34 years of family history. I told him I'd planned to keep it quiet, to let him have his relationship with my grandfather's memory intact. I paused and then continued, saying that was until I'd heard about his plans. I mentioned that my cousin had let it slip 3 weeks ago, right after the funeral, that my uncle was planning to challenge my inheritance. I said that when I'd realized he was going to use questions about my legitimacy as a weapon, I decided I couldn't let that stand. My aunt was crying now. She asked if my grandmother had known. I said I didn't think so. I explained that from what I could piece together, my grandmother had been married to my grandfather for about a year when she'd gotten pregnant. I mentioned that the timeline was tight enough that she probably hadn't questioned it herself. I added that the man who was my uncle's biological father had left town around the same time, probably for unrelated reasons. The attorney interjected, saying he needed time to review all of this properly. He stated that if the genetic evidence held up to scrutiny, it would significantly impact the estate distribution. He asked if we could reconvene in a week. My uncle finally looked at me. He asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted what my grandfather intended, for his assets to be divided fairly among his actual descendants. I said that meant me, my cousins, and anyone else who could prove biological relation. I added that as for him, that was between him and his conscience. One of my cousins, the oldest one, spoke up. He said this was insane, that we couldn't just throw out their father based on some DNA test. He insisted that his dad had been my grandfather's son in every way that mattered. I agreed that family was more than genetics. I said that was exactly the point I'd been trying to make, which was why my uncle's attack on my legitimacy had been so particularly cruel. I mentioned that he'd been willing to destroy my connection to the family based on nothing but suspicion and old photographs, but now that real evidence had emerged about his own parentage, suddenly genetics shouldn't matter. The attorney said he thought it was best if we all took some time to process this. He mentioned that he'd need to consult with the court about how to proceed. He stated that estate law in these situations was complex, especially when new genetic evidence emerged after death. As people started gathering their things, my aunt approached me. She asked if I was going to tell everyone, make this public. I told her that was up to them. I said I had no interest in humiliating anyone or destroying family relationships. I explained that I'd only brought this out because I'd been forced to defend myself. I added that as far as I was concerned, it could stay in this room. She thanked me quietly and then asked if my grandfather had known. I said I didn't think so. I mentioned that if he had, he would have said something, changed his will, done something to address it. I explained that my grandfather had been a direct man. Secrets hadn't been his style. I told her this had probably died with my grandmother 20 years ago. Over the next week, I got several calls from family members. Some were angry, accusing me of manufacturing evidence. Others were sympathetic, saying my uncle had overstepped and brought this on himself. A few just wanted to understand what had really happened. My uncle didn't call. The attorney did, though. He said he'd had the DNA evidence reviewed by an independent expert, and it had checked out. He explained that the genetic markers were clear. My uncle was not biologically related to my grandfather. He mentioned that this created a complicated legal situation, as my uncle had been living as my grandfather's son for over 60 years and had been named as such in the will. He asked if I'd be willing to negotiate a settlement. I thought about it for a day before responding. Then I called the attorney back and said I would agree to a settlement, but with conditions. I told him I wanted my full inheritance as outlined in the original will. That wasn't negotiable. I said that as for my uncle's share, I thought it should be divided among his children, my cousins, who were still my grandfather's grandchildren through their mother's side. The attorney seemed surprised. He asked about my uncle. I said my uncle could keep the house my grandfather had left him and a trust fund worth about 10% of the total estate. I explained that he'd cared for my grandfather in his final years, and that deserved recognition regardless of biology. I added that I wasn't interested in leaving him destitute or humiliated. I just wasn't going to be erased from my own family. The attorney said he'd present the offer. 2 days later, I got a call from my uncle. His voice was rough, like he hadn't been sleeping. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd proposed, and he wanted to talk face to face. We met at a diner halfway between our homes. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the arrogance that had always defined him completely gone. He sat across from me and just stared at his coffee for a while. Finally, he said he'd been wrong. He admitted that he'd let jealousy and bitterness turn him into someone he didn't recognize. He told me that when my grandfather had set up that trust fund for me, something had broken inside him. He said he'd spent his whole life trying to be the perfect son, and then I'd come along and made it look effortless. He continued, saying that when my grandfather had gotten sick, he'd seen an opportunity. He explained that he'd convinced himself that if he could just prove I wasn't really family, then maybe he could finally be enough. He said he'd never actually believed the rumors about my mother. He just wanted them to be true. He apologized, and I could see he meant it. I told him I understood jealousy, understood feeling like you were never quite good enough. I said what I couldn't understand was being willing to destroy someone else to make yourself feel better. He nodded and said he'd accept my settlement offer. He mentioned that it was more generous than he deserved. He asked if I wanted him to tell his kids the truth about his paternity. I said that was his decision. I told him they'd probably figure it out eventually. Genetic testing was only getting more common. I suggested that hearing it from him might be better than discovering it by accident. He agreed and then asked if we could ever get past this. I thought about it. I told him honestly that I didn't know. I said that family was complicated, that genetics didn't make or break relationships, but neither did shared holidays and fishing trips. I explained that he'd tried to erase my history, my connection to my grandfather, my legitimacy in my own family. I added that those wounds didn't heal quickly. He accepted that. He said he'd sign whatever papers were needed and then give me space. Update 1. The settlement was finalized a month later. I got my full inheritance. My cousins got their grandfather's estate divided among them. minus what went to my uncle's trust. My uncle kept the house and enough money to live comfortably. The family was fractured, though. Half of them thought I'd been vindictive, using DNA to punish my uncle for a mistake. The other half thought I'd been more than fair given the circumstances. Family gatherings became awkward affairs where people chose sides. My uncle did tell his children the truth. They took it hard, not because they loved their grandfather less, but because it meant reevaluating their entire family history. The oldest one stopped speaking to me entirely, convinced I destroyed their father's life out of spite. But the youngest, my cousin who I'd been closest to growing up, reached out. She said she understood why I'd done what I'd done. She told me her father had been heading down a dark path, and maybe this had been the wake-up call he'd needed. She said she'd found some old letters in her grandmother's things, and there'd been hints there if anyone had been looking. Update 2. 6 months after everything went down, I got a letter from my uncle. He'd been going through my grandfather's papers and found something he thought I should have. Inside the envelope was a letter my grandfather had written but never sent, dated about a year before he died. In it, my grandfather wrote about his sons, both of them. He talked about my father, how proud he'd been of him, how much he'd missed him since his death. Then he talked about my uncle, about the man he'd raised and loved despite growing suspicions over the years. My grandfather wrote that he'd taken one of those DNA tests himself, curious about his ancestry. He'd seen the results, seen that my uncle didn't match. He'd spent weeks deciding what to do about it, whether to confront anyone, whether to change his will. In the end, he'd decided it didn't matter. He wrote that my uncle had been his son in every way that counted, that genetics was just biology, but family was choice. He said he'd loved my uncle as much as he'd loved my father, and nothing would change that. But then the letter took a different turn. My grandfather wrote that he was disappointed in the man my uncle had become in recent years, bitter, jealous, always comparing himself to others. He said he'd heard the rumors my uncle had been spreading about my parentage, and it had broken his heart. He wrote that if my uncle continued down that path, if he tried to use those lies to hurt me after he was gone, then maybe consequences would be appropriate. He said he trusted that the truth would come out one way or another, and that everyone would get what they deserved. The letter was never finished, never signed. But the message was clear. My grandfather had known everything and had made his peace with it. He'd just hoped it wouldn't come to this. I called my uncle after reading it. I told him I wanted him to see the letter. We met again, same diner, same awkward coffee. He read it twice, tears streaming down his face. He said he'd wasted so much time being angry, being jealous, trying to prove something that had never needed proving. He told me that my grandfather had been the only father he'd ever known, and knowing that the old man had loved him anyway, even knowing the truth, meant everything. I said I knew. I told him that maybe we both needed to learn to live with complicated truths about family and love and inheritance. I mentioned that we didn't have to be close, but we didn't have to be enemies either. He agreed. He said he'd make sure his kids knew the full story, including the part where I'd offered him far more than I had to. He said maybe someday they'd understand. We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. The inheritance was settled, the family was fractured, and everyone had learned some difficult truths about blood and belonging. I kept my grandfather's letter. Sometimes I take it out and read it, reminded that family is messy and complicated, that genetics matter less than character, but that sometimes you have to stand up for yourself even when it tears everything apart. My uncle had declared blood over everything, weaponizing genetics to exclude me from my own family. In the end, blood had told a different story, one that neither of us had wanted to hear, but one that needed to be told. The estate was divided. The family was changed. And I learned that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to refuse to let the living rewrite history in their favor. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.